Welcome back. In the first lecture dealing with French political institutions, I gave a bit of an overview, and the focus of the last lecture was how Charles de Gaulle created the first republic from a conservative perspective, right? The current French, the current French Constitution, excuse me, uh, was created by de Gaulle, who believed that the first four republics, and especially the third and fourth republics, were flawed for two primary reasons. One was that the third and the fourth republics lacked a strong executive officer. So de Gaulle created in his constitution a very strong president, a president that originally had a 7-year term with no term limits. We'll talk about how that was changed later. And today, the president has a 5-year term and is limited to 2 consecutive terms. The other big drawback of the third and the fourth republics from de Gaulle's perspective was simply a legislature that was too unstable to govern. And I talked a lot about the turnovers and coalitions, etc. And so de Gaulle did a couple of things. One was the creation of the strong executive, and two was a more coherent legislature that has elections based on single member districts instead of proportional representation. I also talked about how France is different from both the United States and Great Britain in that the president has control over the legislature, can call for elections early for the legislature without putting his seat up at risk. And of course, it is the president who selects the premier or prime minister, not the legislature. So the French system has elements of a presidential system. For example, the president and the legislature being elected independently, but it is really a hybrid of the two. At the end of the lecture, I also discussed very briefly how the French system is incredibly popular with their citizenry, a lot more popular than, say, American institutions are with the American public. Now, in the historical section, I talked about how the first four republics all failed relatively quickly, other than the Third Republic. And if you take a look at the current French Republic, it also had its challenges, but it survived them. And in your notes, I have listed the French Fifth Republic has survived two important tests. The first one is, I believe, found in every new political system. The shift from one governing coalition to another. In the United States, there was some real fear. For example, when John Adams was defeated by Thomas Jefferson in the election of 1800, that John Adams might not give up political power to Jefferson. And of course, the United States survived that shift from the Federalists to the Democratic Republicans. France had an even kind of scarier transition of power because the French conservatives, who are generally called the Gaullists or the Neo-Gaullists, had governed France for over 20 years. Remember, the Constitution took place in 1959, and de Gaulle and his conservative successors ruled the country until the socialist victory of 1981. And so the election of Francois Mitterrand for 14 years as a socialist president of France was one of the important tests that the Fifth Republic has survived. Now, the second is something that you and I take for granted in America on a regular basis. We have this right now. It's this concept that we call divided government in America. We have a Republican president currently, Donald Trump, and the House of Representatives is dominated by his political enemies, the Democrats. Now, when we have divided government in France, the French use a very different name for this. It's called cohabitation. or power sharing with the opposing party or coalition. And of course, when this happens, when you have a president of one party and when you have a coalition of another party, um, then the president has to choose a premier of the other party. Now, this has not occurred very often in France. The French political system is now over 60 years old, and the French have had this divided government, or what they call cohabitation, less than 10% of the time. They've only had three very brief periods of 2 years apiece in which one political party dominated the legislature and the other the president. And those were from 1986 to 1988, 1993 to 1995, and then after 1997. And so you don't know the names, need to know the names. Obviously, twice this happened with the socialist president, Mr. Mitterrand, who then was forced to choose a conservative premier, and Mitterrand elected a future president and nominated him to be the new prime minister, and that was Mr. Chirac. Later, Mr. Mitterrand had to select Mr. Balladur, who became a presidential candidate but never won. In fact, political commentators believe that the period of cohabitation between Mr. Mitterrand and Mr. Balladur was the best of those three periods of cohabitation. So France survived those two tests, survived them very well. We have not had cohabitation for the last 20 years, and we probably won't, because elections were changed. French presidents are now elected for only 5 years, and legislative elections are only a couple months after the presidential elections. And so what we have seen since that change in terms is when presidents are elected, they have been given a loyal legislature in every election over the last 20 years. Now, if you scroll down in here, this will move to lecture 2, I believe, in your notes, the dominance of the president. The French president is really dominant for several reasons. One is that the National Assembly is one of the weakest national legislatures in the world. The second is that the government is virtually always under the president's direction, which guarantees executive dominance. So this gives French presidents, in my opinion, more control of the legislature than virtually any democratic nation. There are a couple of reasons why I believe presidents are so powerful, and of course, I just illustrated two of the French presidents. They are the two presidents that I believe are the most important in French history. Charles de Gaulle, who is the idol of conservatives. Mr. de Gaulle was president from 1959, technically. I put 1958 in the notes because that's when the Constitution was actually written, but he formally wasn't president until 1959. He was president for a decade, and of course, if you are a liberal, the personality that you are going to look to as your model of powerful and effective leadership is Francois Mitterrand. And Mitterrand was president of France longer than any other president. He was elected for 2 7-year terms, so he was elected for 14 years. As I mentioned in an earlier lecture, de Gaulle is the most influential French politician of the 20th century, in my opinion. He led the resistance during World War II. Interestingly, Mitterrand was also a resistance leader during World War II. And Mitterrand and de Gaulle became real rivals for power. And of course, de Gaulle defeated Mitterrand in a couple of elections, and I'll talk about that later. But Mitterrand, after being defeated on two occasions running for the presidency, ended up creating a very intriguing political alliance of the left, and was elected twice and served for 14 years. So one factor that goes into the dominance of the president is the weakness of the legislatures that have tended to be very supportive of the president. But the second factor, I think, are powerful presidents. And certainly, I think that you can make this argument in the United States when we think about presidential power. If you take a look at Mount Rushmore and you look at the pantheon of great American presidents, they have been presidents with strong personalities. And so whether it's Abraham Lincoln, who right? Suspended habeas corpus, engaged in numerous illegal activities, and yet is given a pass because his goals were goals and motives were good. That was to save the Union. Or certainly Franklin Roosevelt, who responded very decisively to the Great Depression with the New Deal. Or George Washington, who established numerous precedents that you do not find in the Constitution. For example, George Washington is a president who created the cabinet, the major federal agencies of government, even though there is nothing in the Constitution that suggests that there is a cabinet. Certainly, you can look at Thomas Jefferson and the purchase of the Louisiana Purchase from the French, or Teddy Roosevelt in the creation of the national park systems, and you can go on and on and on. So certainly powerful personalities are crucial in politics. You may think back to when I talked about Great Britain, that just as there are two rock stars in the post World War II era in France, de Gaulle and Mitterrand, I told you that in the period since 1970, say, if you look at the last 50 years of British history, the two most powerful personalities that stand out and that really transform and change British politics, Margaret Thatcher, if you're a conservative, and if you're a liberal, Tony Blair. These two prime ministers are the only prime ministers since World War II to win 3 consecutive elections. Both of them reshaped their political parties. Both of them reshaped the party platforms and agendas of their parties. And so both of them create this very, very long shadow because of their powerful personalities and because they were able to exert their personalities on the political system. In France, both of these men do this. You may remember, I believe I mentioned this joke earlier, but in France, a reporter asked President de Gaulle what he thought about a political party being named after him, the Gaullists. And de Gaulle kind of gave a wry little grin and said, well, if the people must worship me, they must. And certainly that, I think, is a very, very accurate reflection of this very strong personality that de Gaulle had. Mitterrand had nearly as much impact on the political system. When he became the Socialist Party leader, the Socialists were the secondary party of the left. The Communists were the leading party. De Gaulle was an Mitterrand was an excellent strategist. He was able to mobilize and he was able to transform the Socialist Party into the major opposition political party for a couple of decades. And then, of course, he ended up becoming the leader and was the chief executive of France for 14 years, longer than anyone else in French history.